Is the United States losing the post-Cold War? Think about that for a moment. The Cold War, going from the end of World War II until about 1989 or 1991, that was a pretty defined time period. And we had a standoff with the Soviet Union. We had a collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. We had societies embrace democracy and market economy, join the European Union and join NATO. And so there was a sense, as Frank Fukuyama famously wrote about, that this was the end of history, that democracy and market economy and these values had won out. Well, 25, 26 years later, you look around the world today and you see things like ISIS, and are having to deal with this growing collapse of the Middle East and the growing phenomenon of Islamist extremism and violence, the return of dictatorships in the Middle East. You see Putin with an authoritarian Russia that's invading its neighbors. You see China militarily asserting its claims to the South China Sea. And you have to ask yourself, is all this going right? Or did we really win? Or did we win only to lose? And that's the question we're teeing up for tonight's debate. To tackle this question, we always divide people into two teams. And I will be honest with you from the outset. We deliberately tee up a black and white provocative question. Yes or no, are we losing? The reality is that any serious person that we have ever put in one of these debates sees nuances. You'll see something on this side, something on that side. It will not be as black and white a presentation as the question implies. But we have organized people to try to make the case of how we can think about this. Are we in fact losing, or are we in fact not losing? The first team, those who will be making the argument that, in fact, the United States is really losing the post-Cold War after having won the Cold War, are Mike Moyar and DJ Peterson. Mike Moyar is a veteran of Rand Corporation, of SOCOM. He's worked with General Crystal. He is an author, and he has written this book called Strategic Failure, which is how President Obama's drone warfare, defense cuts, and military amateurism have imperiled America. So no doubt where he is coming from. Now that is to take the case together with DJ Peterson, who is local and maybe known to many of you. He is with Longview Advisors and formerly with the Eurasia Group and formerly with the Rand Corporation. Takes something more of an economic approach and takes something more of a private sector business look at what's happening in the world, but also making the case that in fact things are not going our way. On the opposite side of the equation, we have two people who I have known. I think in the case of Kori, it's now bordering on 27 years. And in the case of Jim Foley, we're probably looking at 21 or 22. These are old friends from different walks of life. Kori, I met when she was working at the Joint Staff, working with the military in 1988 and 89, and we were working together on the CFE treaty. She has gone on to an illustrious career in many, many things. She's an author in her own right, of course, but she has also been a professor at West Point, a professor at the University of Maryland. She was the director for defense issues at the National Security Council at a time when I was doing European issues. She is now at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She was the National Security Advisor, Defense Policy Advisor for the McCain campaign in 2008. She is a well-known expert on defense issues, and she will be making the case that not so fast. We're still the United States. And Jim Foley is an old friend and colleague as well. Jim was in the Foreign Service for, he said, 32 years, which makes me feel better now because the last few times I've been introduced, people have said I've been doing foreign policy issues for 30 years. That's the first time I ever heard that 30 number. So to say somebody else has done it for 32 years makes me feel better. And Jim was in the Philippines. He was in Algeria. He was ambassador to Haiti. He was ambassador to Croatia. He was charged with processing Iraqi refugees and asylum seekers as they were coming out of Iraq during our occupation of Iraq. He was the deputy spokesman of the State Department. And I think he comes with a wealth of experience about our country's role in the world, how we do things and what we can think about and look forward to in the future. So that's the structure of tonight's debate, and I am delighted that all of you came to hear this tonight. We are also live webcasting this, and it will be available online as well. Our website is mccaininstitute.org. I have to say you don't look like a tweeting audience, but if you are, the hashtag is hashtag #MIDebate, and it does stimulate a little bit of a commentary online that we can refer back to as well. The structure of the debate is 4 minutes introduction from each side making a case, 2 minutes from each side responding to that case. Then I, as moderator, will start asking a few questions and try to draw them into a debate with each other. And then I'll turn to you, the audience, to ask questions as well. And I hope that we have some thoughtful and insightful and provocative questions from you as members of the audience. The one thing I would ask is that when we come to the questions from the audience, to please be brief and please be pointed in your questions so that we can get the most out of hearing from our debaters on stage. With that, I'm going to open it up and turn to our first team, Mike and DJ, to answer the question, is the U.S. losing the post-Cold War?
Thanks, Ambassador. I think most Americans believe, in fact, 70% of Americans believe the U.S. is losing, and I think so. It's a pretty clear case. I'd like to argue on 3 points. One is geopolitics, second is economics, third is domestic politics. Geopolitics. Obviously, we could look at what was going on this week in Paris, very tragic, but also very alarming. I think one of the key lessons for me is the pace of innovation in terrorism. We thought Al-Qaeda was bad, but ISIS is much different. Their ability to recruit, to raise money, to run a state is something that the US is just not well equipped to compete with. And if you look at their kind of apocalyptic, millenarian kind of death cult, I mean, we're an enlightenment, Candide-oriented society. We want to think about the positives, and life is happy and good. I think we're going to have a real trouble fighting this or matching this death cult. That's terrorism. Look at Russia. Their mission today is to reassert their rightful place in the world, something that they had for hundreds of years. We are not prepared to fight that battle. Russians are behind Putin. This is a national mission. The same with China. It's called the East China Sea. It's the South China Sea. It's not the East and West American Sea. They feel is rightfully theirs. They're building islands. They're building landing strips for their airplanes. How are we really going to compete with them? We don't even have the guts. We don't have the ability to mount the Navy. Look at economics. If we think about economics and how countries project power, it's through trade. China 2 years ago eclipsed the United States as the world's largest trading nation. And who calls the rules? IP, intellectual property protections, cyber. They're setting the rules of trade. Now, the Pacific, the trade agreement that we have in the Pacific is quaint, but really, are we going to be able to shape implementation? No. So I think the rules of the road in the future and economically are fundamentally not ours to control. If you think about it, we shape the rules in the post-war era. Today we don't. And finally, I want to just turn to politics. You think about how this nation derives its strength. It's through domestic politics. Congress is the greatest legislative institution in the world. Well, that's what they like to say, but we know it's not. It's a farce. And everybody sees it. Our country is paralyzed politically. We're very polarized, and I think the ambassador rightfully pointed out, we're more about fighting each other than thinking about the global challenges the United States faces. So we can't muster a realistic defense budget. We can't muster the kind of international foreign aid that we need, or the programs that we need to project American power. We're really fighting with each other, and it's based on political paralysis. So I'll stop.
Certainly there are broad trends that the United States doesn't have full control over, but in the post-9/11 era, and I would argue as the world's greatest power, we've had, to a large extent, the ability to forge our destiny. And the Bush administration certainly made some major errors. In the time we have here, I'm going to focus just on the more recent events with the Obama administration. I do think there were decisions made by this administration that have broad problems I see within the current administration. The problem is there's a decision to withdraw from a lot of military commitments, a decision to cut the defense budget, and to try to find substitutes for military power, such as surgical strikes, development assistance, and diplomacy. And none of those have worked out very well. If you look at some of the major problem areas, Iraq, I think in 2009 was fairly stable. I think the withdrawal of our troops from there set that on a course for disintegration, rise of ISIS. In the case of Syria, we had a choice to support Syria's rebels, and we didn't do so, and we ran out of time to support them. There's a lot of other cases I can go into. Just in terms of Russia and China, we have played our strong hand really poorly, and we've allowed Russia and China to gain initiative on a lot of issues. And a lot of the world powers in both of those regions gravitating towards China and Russia, which in the United States, I think, has moral authority, and the fact that we are losing influence to those countries just is an indication of how much we advocate. So, just say, I don't think the situation's irreversible, but certainly the presidential leadership needs to change fundamentally if we're to turn things around.
Let me turn to our opposing side here, and Jim, let me turn that to you to start, and then Kori. It sounds pretty bleak.
Well, I'm going to answer the question that was put, which is, are we losing the post-Cold War? Not are we winning post-Cold War? Different question, different answer. I think there's no question that U.S. influence in the world is on the decline compared to the Cold War, compared to the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the so-called unipolar moment, and our ability to shape, much less dominate the world is not what it was. It's not what it was 15 years ago. It's not what it was 20 years ago. And part of that was due, I would argue, to our invasion of Iraq, which turned into a quagmire, which depleted not only our resources, our treasure, but also the public's appetite for American engagement in the world, with meanwhile China benefiting very much as it rises in power. But I think, though, that fundamentally, though, this decline in U.S. Power influence was inevitable and is structural. It's due to the radically changing configuration of power in the world, the fact that we are now in a multipolar world with many new rival powers, with multiplying threats. It's a world that's much harder for anyone to control. It's a world that in many ways is seemingly running out of control. But in that context, I would say, though, that losing implies that there's a winner. And I don't see someone beating us in the Cold War. I think our rivals, China and Russia, have enormous problems. They face the same complexity, but they have bigger liabilities. And they lack some of the inherent advantages that we have. Whether we are drawing on those advantages as well as we could, again, is another question. But the fact that we enjoy the security of our geography, that we have friendly neighbors, that we have strong partnerships and alliances, and a fundamentally strong economy makes for, as I said, advantages that others, our rivals, don't have. Finally, I would say that in relation to the multiplying threats in the world, there I would say we are emphasized that we are not winning. But I see that, and I would echo my colleague, worthy adversary in this regard. I see this more as a function of our domestic problems, our inadequate leadership in response to many of these threats, which again, our colleagues have highlighted, really, in my view, has fundamentally domestic roots, and I hope we come to that later on.
So one of the pleasures of being a historian of 19th century America is realizing that we're not newly a country full of crazy, disputatious people run by middling politicians. That's what we, the United States, have always been, right? And very often these discussions about America in decline and whether America's losing the Cold War, whether America's losing the post-Cold War, they take the present and project it into the future. And I would like to suggest to you that actually the great dynamism and success of the United States is that you very rarely can make linear projections from us to the future, because what we are is people who overturn the economy with new models, sometimes catastrophic models, for example, on housing finance in the early 2000s. But the dynamism of American society and the very disputatiousness that we very often are sorrowful about in our political discourse are how we get to the right answer. There's a magnificent article, my favorite thing ever written about American foreign policy, is by the journalist James Fallows, and it was when he came back from being the correspondent in China. And it's about the role of the Jeremiad in American foreign policy, right? Remember the book of Jeremiah from the Torah and the Bible? The notion is that we always think we're failing, right? We always think we're falling apart. We always think we're bad at things. And that's actually how we fix things. So if you think about 2 points in time when the United States was considered at the zenith of its power, let's take 1954, right? America still had something like 30% of global GDP coming out of World War II. We were rebuilding Europe in our image, and yet the 101st Airborne was not training. They were forcibly integrating schools in the American South, right? The McCarthy hearings were going on where Congress was claiming that the Army was staffed with traitors, right? So we overestimate just how wonderful the past was, that there was this mythic day where politics stopped at the water's edge and we were civil to each other. We never were, right? Let's take 1973, another point in time in which people thought the United States was at the zenith of its power. That's the middle of the Vietnam War. Not even the British would fight that alongside us, and we were fighting it in a way that would cast a long shadow over America and Americans' willingness to shape the international order.
We're going to leave it there. But I want to bring it back then to Mark and DJ. So basically, it's always like this. You know, the world comes and goes. We're fine. Do you buy that?
Well, I'll just, again, take a little bit more of a structural point of view. I think the disputatiousness is wonderful. We love to dispute. We love democracy. We love the ability to kind of ponder ideas. But ISIS is not. They're running fast forward. And so I think if you look at the world today, the pace of change and the challenges that we're facing, whether it's terrorism, whether it's cyber, and everybody I talk to in the business world, they say it's getting worse and you don't have a solution. It's going to get worse. If you look at climate, it just seems like we're dithering, and we're kind of enjoying the debate, or we're thinking about entertainment on television and enjoying that disputatiousness, but really not watching the world kind of move on or slip by us.
I want to comment on very interesting points that our adversaries here were raising about the public will, because I do think it's fundamental to this question. And certainly the invasion of Iraq did not turn out as people wanted, and I think strategically wise thing to do. But if you look back to the 2008 election, President Obama was actually running on a platform of increasing the war in Afghanistan, and so I think we need to bear in mind that the American people do have some resilience. I mean, if you look back at during the surge, there were a lot of people saying that Iraq war had been lost, and yet President Bush decided to put more troops in, and it turned out to work pretty well. And even in the 2012 presidential debate, when Romney argued that Obama was going to gut the military, Obama assured the American people, we're not going to let sequestration happen. But if you look at our military spending today, less than 4% of GDP is actually historically quite low, and yet a lot of people think this has become very expensive. I think we certainly have the resources to do it, but there is a broader question of where do the American people want to go? And certainly you see these trends in isolationism, and you can make the case that, well, the isolationism we see right now is just temporary. American people are going to bounce back. I'm hoping that's the case. I'm not totally sure that is, though. I think there is a danger. Certainly, one of the discussions Kori and I have actually discussed this
the millennial generation, are they really turning towards isolationism? So I think some people think there certainly is a case that they're very libertarian oriented, and they really don't care what's going on in other countries.
We're gonna pause it there, and I want to come back to this side then. Here's the way I want to tee this up to you. Okay, I'm gonna take Kori's starting point, which is, yeah, we're disputatious people. We always feel like we're doing worse than we really are. Isn't this actually really different, though? I mean, isn't what we're seeing with ISIS and the ideological issues different? Isn't what we're seeing with China different? And Putin is just icing on the cake. Maybe he's not different, but that's on top of all these other things.
So I want to start by addressing DJ's very good point about structural factors, right? Because the way the international order is changing, globalization stampeding progress, the advances in communication, right? Governments used to have a monopoly on information. No government can believe that they do anymore. The way that free markets have advanced to lift 1 billion people out of poverty is a magnificent advance. I think the question that I would challenge our colleagues with is the structural factors that you think are so damaging to the American economy and advantageous, for example, to China. Can China continue to see the kind of growth it has without the kind of political opening that has made progress sustainable in other societies? Before I let you answer it, though, I want to say that if you think about the way technology is advancing, communication is advancing, travel is advancing, what that does is advantage societies who can manage change, right? The adaptable societies are the ones who are prospering in this. China's an adaptable society. There is no society as adaptable as us. And the challenges that DJ rightly raises, ISIS, Russia, these are the challenges of societies that are failing at adaptation to how the international order is changing. And we definitely need to deal with those, but the long-term structural effects are actually advantaging those of us who can adapt to changing circumstances, and that is America's great strength.
Let's stick with that point. Before we get to Jim, we'll come back to you for another thing, but I want to then continue with the first question then. This point of adaptability. This is something that Kori just made a strong case for. The United States is going to be the best at this. So even though we have ISIS, even though we have China, we're not losing, we're just seeing change. And in the end, we're going to be the society that's doing the best. How do you disagree with that?
Yeah, this piece about technology, I think, is really interesting. When I was at my last report at RAND was on the information revolution in Russia, and the big conclusion that we found was that Russia got the internet in the first part of this century. Russians are very adapted using the internet, and at the same time, you saw the rise of Putin or the consolidation. They know what's going on in the world, but they want to be a strong power. The Chinese, there's hundreds of millions of people on the internet in China, and what they want is a strong China, and they want a China that challenges the United States and makes China the greatest nation in the world.
But that's not the only thing they want, right? 300,000 Chinese students are at American universities every single year. And they probably don't go home hoping their Congress behaves like our Congress. But they probably do go home, at least some of them, wishing they had a government they could throw out of power when they don't like the food safety protections, when they don't like the building codes that allow schools to collapse on children. It's poisoned baby milk that's going to bring down the Chinese government because they don't have a way to adapt and address those things in the way free societies do.
Comment too. I think, 10 years ago, there seemed a much greater degree of inevitability partly because the United States has been ineffective in promoting democracy, but there is a sense, in much of the world that democracy wasn't quite as great as it was chalked up to be. And if you go into a lot of underdeveloped countries, they actually find the Chinese model attractive because China's China will move in the direction of liberal democracy, but I'm not sure that it's inevitable. But I think this is a place where the United States is losing, is that there's no longer this sense in much of the world that the United States way is the way to go, and we all need to follow. There's a lack of confidence in our model.
This is a great point. So I'm going to bring Jim in now. You were going to make another point, but particularly what Mark is saying about the belief in the inevitability of Western liberal values versus the on-the-ground evidence of retreat in the effectiveness of implementation of these values around the world. Freedom House reports last 9 years saying democracy is retreating. Are we losing this because of ideology and will?
Well, I think we've learned some very hard lessons, especially in recent years, about how difficult it is to plant the democratic seed around the world. And I think we have much more developed respect for the fact that democracy is the product of decades and maybe centuries of evolution. And so I think that to tie our sense of success in the world to this barometer, which can go up and down. And let's add, we've had some significant successes and advances in democracy, especially in Eastern Europe in the last decades. But I think my point I alluded to is that it is the health of our own democracy which is the most important factor. And it's the strength of our own country and our own institutions which underpin our security and our ability to respond to security challenges around the world, which is the ultimate test. And I think that's where we are not meeting our potential, far from it. And I think the most important factor in enhancing our security and ultimately winning the post-Cold War is addressing the dysfunction that we've been talking about on the stage here at home, even recognizing that we've always been rambunctious. But I believe, though, that the level of dysfunction domestically in the Congress in Washington is having a very injurious effect. I say that as a former and recent American ambassador, and indeed it is an important part of our diplomacy to represent our democratic ideals. And we are not in quite the same position to do so than we were in previous times, sadly.
I'm going to throw this question to Kori, staying on this side to start. All right, let's go to Europe. And I know you know Europe really well. You're a student of Germany. We've had, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen Russia invade Georgia. We've seen Russia invade Ukraine. We've seen them change borders by force. We've seen them annex Crimea. We've seen them toss overboard the CFE treaty that you and I worked on. We've seen them toss overboard the INF treaty. We've seen them toss overboard the Budapest Memorandum that was a guarantee of Ukraine's security. We've seen them completely walk away from the relationship with NATO, where they had previously committed, and in fact in every post-1989 document, committed to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of every European state and to refrain from the threat or use of force. So you're seeing countries in the former Soviet space terribly intimidated right now, finding their way back to Moscow because they don't know where we are. You're seeing authoritarian Russia as opposed to a democratizing Russia. And you're seeing a Germany where you have one former chancellor working for Gazprom, and you have the current German government going along with another Nord Stream pipeline to cut out the Baltic states and Poland. How does this not add up to our losing everything that we thought we achieved, as Jim was saying? You know, in Eastern Europe, we had this great success. Isn't this all coming unraveled?
So I would say two things in response. The first is, I think that's actually deeply unfair to the Federal Republic of Germany that you described it in the way that you did. I think there has been no Western leader, not just European, no Western leader who has been as strong and loud a moral voice as Angela Merkel has been, as Russia has been engaged in all the depredations you said. So I'm not going to defend Schröder, but I do think Angela Merkel is the best politician of our time, because if I had had to bet money that she could stay far enough ahead of markets to foist off a collapse and slow enough that she could actually bring the German public along on the bailout of the European currency, I wouldn't have bet 20 bucks on that proposition. And yet she got the timing exactly right. And on Russia, she has done the same thing. She has been actually quite brave in pushing back, changing the frame of reference in which German business people think about Russia. And she did it on the argument that if there is no rule of law in Russia, then there will be no long-term business prospects in Russia. And that's a values-laden case. That's a very American case. We should be cheering that. And the Russians are playing a very weak hand, very aggressively and well, but that doesn't disguise the fact that they are playing a very weak hand.
I think Kori just won the argument for us. I mean, Angela Merkel is leading, not the United States. Sanctions are a result of German resolve, not US power. The Germans are leading, not the Americans.
I'd say also, the fact that Merkel is the strongest leader in this case is indicative of the problem we face. We recently, the Foreign Policy Initiative hosted the president of Estonia, and he said essentially they have no confidence in Western Europe to defend them from Russia. And I think that's actually one of the most dangerous places in the world right now is the Baltic states, because we've given Putin reason to believe that he can go in there and we'll sit on our hands, but they will then invoke NATO Article 5, and then either we'll have war with Russia or we'll have a collapse of NATO.
Is Russia weak? This is what Kori was making. That they may look like they're doing now, but are they really weak?
I think they're relatively weak militarily. I do think
They can barely beat the Ukrainians.
Well, right now, even if we put a small force in the Baltics, they could probably succeed. But I personally think if we actually put forces in the Baltics on a permanent basis rather than this rotational policy we have, we can actually deter him, because I do think Putin, I mean, he is relatively weak, and he will back down if he sees that we are willing to confront him, but he continues to get the impression that we're going to roll over whenever he does something, and as long as he thinks that, he's going to keep grabbing.
I believe Russia is fundamentally weak, and moving forward into the future will be ever weaker as it declines, especially demographically. And Putin has so mismanaged the Russian economy that they have few prospects long-term for prosperity. But Russia is strong in its neighborhood. It is a military power, and power is the coin of international relations. And let's remember, when we flagellate ourselves for, as you did, for Russia's encroachments and depredations, we presume that we have the power to prevent Russia from doing these things. And never in the Cold War did we think that we could intervene in areas nearest Russia that happened to be in the Warsaw Pact at the time. But we didn't conquer Eastern Europe. We didn't conquer the Russian near abroad. Soviet power collapsed, and there was a period where Russia seemed to be embracing democracy. But in terms of sheer power, we presume that we have something that I don't believe exists, and we face a very delicate dance in extending our power and extending our deterrence, as you rightly suggest, to the Baltics. These countries are now part of NATO, and we have a solemn obligation, and our security and our credibility depends on our willingness to defend them and to project that we will defend them, such that Putin understands that it's not worth the candle. So when we talk about extending our power, extending our deterrence, it becomes more delicate, and we're certainly not going to do it vis-a-vis Russia in a country that's not a member of NATO. And that same paradigm applies even more vis-a-vis China in parts of Asia, where we are facing potential conflicts with China.
So can I say a word on
Yes.
Russia? It is illustrative that Russia has two allies, Belarusia and Syria, right? So we shouldn't be afraid of Germany leading. That's actually the measure of our success, not the measure of our failure. That we have created an international order where the burdens of leadership are shared, the responsibilities of leadership are shared, and the behavior of our enemies, whether ISIS, Russia, or even our frenemies like China, is actually coalescing countries to our cause, right? America's Asian alliances have never been stronger than they are at the moment, and it's because of China's behavior in the South and East China Seas. Our European allies are disappointed in us, as they always are. And yet, the NATO countries are pulling together. We're deploying troops into Eastern Europe, which we hadn't done, into the new NATO members, which we hadn't done before. We're moving into the Baltics. Like, free countries are slow to coalesce to the argument, but we have coalesced. And that's why we've won the post-Cold War, because of the number of nations standing in freedom shoulder to shoulder.
I would say I'm a bit more skeptical on in Asia. I mean, Japan right now is taking encouraging steps, although, you know, I think it's certainly possible the next Japanese government may go in a very different direction. We have seen, you know, the China Development Bank recently, we tried to get most of the region's countries to oppose it because it would undermine our institutions, and even a lot of our longstanding allies actually voted for it, with China against Japan being the one major exception. We've also seen a lot of Asian militaries trying to increase their ties with the Chinese. So I'm more concerned there. I mean, I do think it's good that we are now trying to confront China over these artificial islands, because I think that's one of the most positive things the Obama administration's done. But I think there's certainly a lot of uncertainty within that region.
Let me push back on you guys for a second on China. I'm willing to go after Russia, in any number of ways, but let's take China for a second. China has created a rapidly growing economic miracle from where they were in the 1970s. They have lifted 300 million people out of poverty. They have created a middle class bigger than most countries. They have been an effective participant in the global economy, and are implicitly tied to the global economy for their own well-being. They care about societal goals, societal values, maybe not human rights, definitely not human rights and not democracy, but societal values of poverty reduction, of education, of technology, of development, increasingly about the environment. They have a high prize on stability. So there's a lot of reason to think that even though we're going through the growing pains of a rising China that is going to rival the US in terms of size and capacity in the future, that there's a lot of reason to think that China may end up better and differently than where they were under Mao, and where we would ever expect Russia to be under Putin. But China's a different case. So while it's not something the United States is governing and controlling, we've created an environment where the way China's developing may actually be something that lands in a good place for us.
Yes, again, I think it's really hard to know where things are going to turn out, although those characteristics you mentioned could all have been said about Germany in the 1930s. And there's also similarities. If you look at the rising nationalism within China right now, there are some parallels there. Now, obviously, Germans and Chinese are different people, but I think there is certainly a possibility. I mean, China is trying to exert its power abroad in ways it hasn't done before, and so I mean, I think ideally we will be able to channel those impulses in positive directions. But under the current government, I think there's certainly a lot of danger we have to think about.
Yeah, I really will emphasize this nationalism piece. That's what's holding the country together. As the communist socialist ethic kind of drifts away and becomes less and less relevant, when you see growing income inequality, for instance, or kind of massive failures, whether it's food or environment, it's the nationalism card that is holding that country together and will hold that country together as it gets rougher. So I think as China slows down, actually, it has a lot of hubris, and it is going to channel that energy in other ways. And so the idea that China will be, I think, a peaceful or Western-oriented, big, prosperous country, I think really masks centuries of Chinese history and pride in a sense of their very strong and central place, the central place in the world.
Take the China question here too, Jim, and particularly there's the security side. It went from a $10 billion defense budget in '97 to $145 billion officially today, and it's more like $200 billion if you add other stuff in. They are building up these islands and militarizing them. They're trying to rush us back, and economically, whether you buy into currency manipulation or not, the fact is we've all lost jobs and economic advantage to a growing China. Isn't that another way of losing?
Well, I tend to disagree with the way you framed the previous question, that portraying China as sort of a benign partner, less a rival, and previously painting Russia as the menacing bear, which it may be under Putin, but I think we have much less to fear. And I think that the difference is that we have treaty commitments in Europe that I believe we will meet, and I believe Putin knows that we will meet, and he will not test those, including hopefully in the Baltics. Whereas we have treaty commitments to allies in Asia over issues involving rival territorial claims in the Senkakus and over the South China Sea that may lead to friction and worse in a period in which China's military muscle is expanding, regardless of what their budget is, but in terms of their capabilities, naval and sea power, naval and air power in particular, at a time when our defense capabilities are atrophying, that may put us in some very delicate and potentially dangerous position. So I'm more focused on China than Russia in that respect.
So I agree with DJ's perspective. Namely, I am more concerned about a faltering China than I am about a successful China. Because what I think I notice about the international order is that rising powers are countries the United States can actually figure out how to handle, right? Because they have a positive vision of their future, and we can turn the keys in the locks and find one formulation or another by which we and they can have common interests moving forward. And I actually think in the last 20 years, we've done a pretty good job of that with China, right? The responsible stakeholder business, pointing out that they're the big beneficiaries of this American-dominated international order because it's permitted so much change for them. But Chinese nationalism is a very serious problem, and it's likelier to be a problem for us if they are unsuccessful than if they are successful. But again, I think the challenges for China to get from where they are to where they want to be are enormous. And let me just make a plug for a great new book. It's written by two defense experts, August Cole and Peter Singer. It's called Ghost Fleet. It's a novel about a war between China and the United States in which we lose the opening round. But slight spoiler, I promise I won't give too much away. Our government proves incapable of doing the kind of things that need doing. And they scooped today's news. Hackers forums come in on our side in this conflict, just as the anonymous hackers group has now come in on the fight on ISIS. What free societies are good at doing is lots of things beyond their government. And that's where our long-term success lies.
That's an excellent point. And I want to flip that immediately to DJ and to Mark. If we're measuring military weight and conflict, that's one thing. But if we're measuring societies, and you look at the United States and Western societies as having this incredible resilience, isn't that just by definition meaning that we're winning over time?
That's an excellent question, and I think in this country, I do think we're starting to see, I mean, there's been a push towards multiculturalism in the last few decades, which really, I think, does start to call into question the, the durability of our culture. I think we face, though, a considerably less of a problem in this regard than does Europe, which I think really is, I'm particularly pessimistic about their culture, but also the fact that they have this fairly rapidly expanding Muslim population, which I think just in the last couple of years, we're really seeing some fundamental friction between Europe and its Muslim populations, which, the attacks last week are, clearly ISIS is trying to exploit that division. I think if we were unified, if the West were unified, we'd be in a pretty good shape. But I think a lot of the problem is there's a lot of people within the West that don't actually believe strongly enough in the West.
Yeah, I think this idea of winning by default, maybe that's the case. Maybe we'll just muddle along, we'll struggle, we'll stumble across the finish line first. But that's not winning the post-Cold War era. And that doesn't really comport with America's image of itself. And I think, again, this, if you think about the U.S. as the vanguard, again, that anonymous raising the challenge against ISIS, wow, it's like, the world is really not in America's image if we're really counting on anonymous to help win our war. Just another example, we're heading into the Paris Treaty talks around climate. 54% of the world feels like climate is a serious threat. 45% of Americans think that. We're behind, we're laggards. So where are we going to lead on these issues? So yeah, we might stumble across the finish line, but that's not winning the war.
Let me stick on ISIS for a minute. I want to turn this to Kori. Look, in the 90s, we had Osama bin Laden doing a couple things. We lobbed a few missiles at a chemical weapons plant. 2001, and we had the attacks on the World Trade Center and the coal and the embassies in Africa. And we had 2001, and then we launched into this war against terror and then the war against Iraq. Fast forward to 2015, we've got an Afghanistan that doesn't look fundamentally more stable than 2002, maybe less. We've got an Iraq that looks like it'll never be back together again, an Iraq in three pieces, with a Iran-dominated Baghdad, a Kurdish region that's going to break off. And then we've got Syria that's falling apart. We have an Islamic State, so this is like Al-Qaeda on steroids. It's not just a terrorist network anymore, it's a terrorist network with oil tankers. Then we've got a collapsed Libya. So the Middle East and the broader Middle East region, we talked about the Middle East Initiative, the broader Middle East region is really falling apart and into conflict. Dictatorships trying to hang on, like in Egypt, Islamist terrorist groups like ISIS or in Libya, Islamist political movements trying to dominate, foreign powers and foreign actors like Russia and Syria or Iran or Hezbollah. How is this, how is this not losing fundamentally this whole region that had been so much more stable, in the 90s?
So two things I would say to that. First, I don't think the stability of the 1990s is the right metric because most of the people of the Middle East wished they lived under different governments in the 1990s than they lived under. The repression, the lack of economic development, the lack of opportunity for change. Like, this is a huge, powerful force in the Middle East. They are in the midst of a terrible, wrenching change. And it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back in a lot of societies. It's 1 step forward and 2 steps back in a lot of societies. But they do make progress in all sorts of places. Tunisia is a huge success story.
I was going to ask you, leaving aside Tunisia,
Okay, but right, positive models in the region really matter, right? Because people share ideas, they share best practices, they mimic each other all over the place. There is positive change going on, although it's very hard to see in the midst of all of the violence. The other thing that I would say is that, of course, we are a huge major factor of that violence, both for the Iraq War in 2003 and for abandoning Iraq in 2010, right? Please, please remember that in the Iraqi parliamentary elections in 2010, every major party, every party that succeeded was cross-sectarian, right? Everybody voted for tolerance and inclusiveness in 2010. The institutions were simply not strong enough to manage that when we left. There is positive change going on.
Okay. We're going to open it up to the audience to ask questions and receive comments. If anyone's ready now, I'll call on you. And otherwise, I'm going to pitch one more. I see a gentleman here, Rob. Do we have a mic runner?
Just one.
So the question is, has the West lost, past tense, as if it's over, post-Cold War era? But it seems like we need to understand the Cold War to understand if we won or lost the post-Cold War era. And the clear definition seems to be during the leadership and how we won the Cold War, that there were bad forces at play. Namely the Russians. They were not, it was called the evil empire. And that was a definition, clear, cold, correct definition made. There wasn't any moral or ethical relativism at play, which seems to be going on today. George W. Bush said there's an axis of evil at play, which may have been strong, but we see what Iran is doing these days, excuse me, we're still playing into their hands. So I'm wondering if we're losing the post-Cold War era because we haven't made any definitions as to what's happening in the post-Cold War era and allowing people, governments to do evil, for lack of a better word, and not really being clear on that.
So the question, if I understand it, is are we losing, in fact, because we're failing to react? That we could be doing, but we're not doing. Is that, maybe just a Jim, maybe?
Take it, Jim.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you quoted President Bush having declared an axis of evil, and what I think I was arguing in the beginning is that given the nature of power in the world today, its diffusion and the multiplicity of threats and the growing number of actors that we have to contend with, that it's not in our power simply to label evil and then eliminate it. We're in a kind of international situation that we're not used to. Because for the last 70 years, we were either in a bipolar framework vis-a-vis the axis of evil, the Soviet Union, and then in a period where we felt that we were the dominant power in the world. And my argument is that that is giving way to the old system that prevailed before World War II, where you have growing numbers of power centers and an inability of one power, such as the United States, to control, dictate, and shape. And we have enough challenges on our plate as a global power across the world, coupled with enormous domestic challenges that you're all very familiar with, that the idea that we could wave that wand, if we only waved it properly and labeled our enemies accordingly, to prevail, I think is today is a fiction, and that instead we have to prioritize, we have to marshal our resources, we have to deploy them more intelligently, and above all, we have to get our act together here at home, come to agreement in Washington on the basic direction of our government and what our government has to do to tackle our challenges at home and abroad.
But we could never wave a wand and make things happen. That's not different today. But recognizing a problem, having leadership, and tackling the problem has proved effective in the past. So is that really what's missing?
So I feel like, youngster that you are totally underestimating the amount of moral relativism that went on in the Cold War, right? There were so many Americans who believed things were better in the Soviet Union, and we just, right? Lillian Hellman famously standing up in the McCarthy hearings. So moral relativism, the inability to call evil by its name, I actually don't think is the challenge. The challenge is winning over the bulk of people in societies towards the direction that we want. And again, let me just point out that in 1956, Dwight Eisenhower and his Secretary of State had this long, agonizing conversation because the NATO idea was losing its hold and Europe was lost to us. What are we going to do now? They are on the Soviet side in this.
You guys have a comment on this?
Yeah, I think we had the galvanizing kind of bipolar Cold War that really kind of focused people. And now that we don't have it, we don't know what we want. And you have people like Edward Snowden really scrambling it up even more. So we don't even know what we want, let alone how do we exercise power consistently to get what we think we want.
I would say, I think actually Republicans and Democrats agree by and large in terms of what our main interests in the world are. They don't want our homeland to be attacked. They want a free trade environment that's conducive and favorable to us. But it's the question of, how do you actually protect those interests? And I think where we've struggled particularly is, particularly in this administration, is number one, dealing with adversary nations. Russia, China, Iran have all been tremendously emboldened by a lack of resolve by the United States and have taken full advantage of it. And then there's the question of how do we rebuild the world and our image, is a big one. And I agree with Kori that we had a big chance in Iraq that we blew because Iraq was heading in the right direction. Vice President Biden actually said in 2010 that democracy in Iraq was going to be one of the administration's biggest achievements after he had poo-pooed the war in Iraq. I do think there's a way to do it, but I think it's a long-term process of, you have to build a culture of democracy, and that's a generational approach. And we've tried in many cases to try to democratize in a year or two, and that's where I think we have failed. But I think as a result of that, people have soured on the idea that we're going to remake the world.
I am disgusted that everything is about us, and I'm disgusted that everyone is assuming that our way is the best way for cultures that are completely not like ours, and a lack of respect for each culture in every country, whether it's Russia or China or the Middle East. Who the hell says that our way is best? Why are we the authority that says our way is best? And how dare we think that we have the right to impose our systems on other people? Okay. And that to me is the crux of one of the issues, is that we walk in there with our cowboy boots on, thinking that we are the right way, and 9 times out of 10 we're shown that we're not.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we go first to DJ or Mike? Do you want to?
Well, I'll just comment on that. I think, one reason I think Americans think that is that we did impose our way on Germany and Japan, and that seems to have worked out pretty well for us. I think, I personally have been someone who has been resistant to imposing our way in a lot of cases. I mean, I've written a few books on the Vietnam War, which actually said that one of our biggest mistake in Vietnam was trying to turn the Vietnamese government into an American government. But I think, we have to realize it's actually on both Republicans and Democrats go through phases where they want to do this. And I think it's certainly a good question to ask, should we be doing this? Is there any moral, advantage to it? And I personally think, again, I think the way we can influence people the most is that bring them over here and let them experience our country, and we've actually had some success with that. A lot of the success stories in Asia have been led by people who are educated in our universities.
So you make it sound as though we are making people watch Hollywood movies and use the internet and want a 24-hour news cycle and want governments they can throw out of power. But actually, the reason the United States is so dominant in the international order is because most people choose to do voluntarily what we want. And we're not marching into Russia and making them be us. We're not marching into Saudi Arabia and making them be us. We're not marching into Israel and making them be us. They're all different from us. Where we create change in other societies, the Iraq War and one or two other examples, mostly how we change the world is by the power and magnetism of our ideas. It's the belief that people have rights and they loan them to governments in limited ways for limited purposes. So it's true that 90% of people polled in Russia support Vladimir Putin. Would you tell an anonymous phone caller if you were a Russian citizen that you didn't support Vladimir Putin? Of course not, right? But it turns out there's a fair amount of evidence that the truths we hold to be self-evident are actually mostly what other people want. It's what a mother of 6 in the tribal areas of Pakistan actually yearns for, is the things we take for granted.
I want to pass the microphone to the middle table here to the Honorable Consul General of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Scotland.
Wow,
Wales
what
and
an introduction.
Wales.
Actually, building on the comments of the last two commentators and questioners, and it seems to me a big part of a definition of success would be a strong multilateral institutions. So I'd be very interested to know the panel's view on whether multilateral institutions are strengthening or weakening.
Mr. Ambassador, do you want to take that first?
No.
Okay.
We'll let DJ go.
I think in some ways they're there by default. You know, if you think about the post-war era, the U.S. was largely the architect of multilateral institutions that mattered in the world. Again, I think in today's world, the U.S. is fundamentally ambivalent. If we think about IMF reforms, if we think about some major treaties that are out there, governing warfare, for instance, or atrocities of war, we're very ambivalent. We're not parties. We're not members of the International Criminal Court. So, in fact, there are a lot of multilateral institutions, and many of them are trying to make their way without the United States or despite the United States. So the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank is a prime example. So I think they do matter. In some cases, they're weakened or they're not as powerful as they are because the United States is extremely, in my view, conflicted. Okay. And it goes all the way through society. It's not just the White House.
Okay.
And we always have been, right? Like you have the great institutional moment after World War II that is a function of the catastrophe of the international order and the cost we paid to restore it. So you have this one great shining moment of multilateralism. I think some institutions are strengthening. I think NATO's strengthening. I think even the EU is strengthening. I wouldn't have bet $20 they could get through the last 8 years as well as they have. I don't think the United Nations is weakening. I think it's actually always been weak, right? And because of the 5-power structure in it. But I think we are missing huge opportunities. The main treaty I would like to see my country ratify is the Law of the Sea Treaty, because we're the main beneficiaries of it. But we're missing lots of opportunities like this, and I agree with your underlying premise that the health of multilateral institutions is an important measure of our success.
If we could pass a microphone back there, and I want to raise a follow-up to this while we do. After World War II, the U.S. was a principal architect of international institutions and a new rule of law order.
Mm-hmm.
United Nations, NATO, Central Treaty Organization, IMF, World Bank, European Coal and Steel Community, Marshall Plan, International Court of Justice, a whole array of things designed by people to say, this can't happen again. We're going to create law and order, and it's going to be modeled on democratic values. PJ just said is the United States now is at best ambivalent about this, fearing, and this is where I'm taking your argument further, fearing that if we pursue these things, they're going to be turned against us. That we do an international criminal court, and people are going to go after U.S. soldiers in that court. We do the law of the sea, and it's going to impose on the United States against our freedom of maneuver and activities in the area. The question is really to Kori or Jim, isn't that indicative of our actually having lost this? We started out the right way with the best of intentions, and in fact, it's not working out that way.
No, it's a testament to the fact that political leaders won't explain to my mom that American soldiers aren't going to get dragged in front of the International Criminal Court because we have a functioning justice system in this country that's going to adjudicate those things, right? It's the failure of political leadership. It's not a more systemic problem.
I would agree with that. Strong political leadership could, in principle, bring us into these instruments. But let's be clear, the nature of our political system, our psychology, is a deep distrust. That's a political fact of international entanglements and UN-type obligations. This is something that politicians stoke, but they also respond to. It's not an easy case for American statesmen to make. They ought to be doing it, and I agree with you completely. It's in our fundamental interest to be in the Law of the Sea Treaty. It would increase our leverage against the Russians up in the Arctic. It would increase our leverage against vis-a-vis the Chinese in the South China Sea. And our military strongly supports its ratification. We can't get it through the Congress. It's despite, I think, support from the executive. So, yes, political leadership is needed. But as you said, our history indicates otherwise over time.
A question from the back.
Yes, thank you. I think there have been various references to an abdication of U.S. leadership, and you can see, I mean, the pendulums here seem to swing. We had a cowboy administration. Now we have a very reticent administration. But I would like to put the question to the panel of, now you have a situation where before the events that just occurred in France, it was unclear what a strong executive should do in Syria to prevent the extreme flow of migrants and to resolve that very difficult situation. Now, in light of the French attacks, if you wanted to see America take a stronger role in, let's say, not losing the post-Cold War, what should a strong executive, if we had one, do in Syria and Iraq in the current situation?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, Mark, why don't you kick off?
Oh, that's the phone.
What do we do in Syria?
Yeah, Syria is probably the most difficult place in the world right now to deal with. And I think there were some fairly easy fixes, or fixes at least had a chance of success. In 2012, there were a lot of moderate nationalist groups that were asking for our assistance. And General Petraeus, Secretary of State Clinton, and others were actually urging the administration to provide arms to these groups. We did not do so. In the ensuing years, most of those groups were either killed off or they were co-opted by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So you now have a much more difficult proposition. And also, most of the people who study Syria will tell you that a long-term solution requires getting rid of Assad. Well, now that Russia has come in, Assad looks like he's got a pretty good grip on power there. So that has, I think, further constrained what our good options are. Now there certainly seems to be opportunities for cooperation with Russia now to go after ISIS, but there is a population of about 20 million people in Syria and Iraq, the Sunni population, who view Russia, Syria, and Iran as mortal enemies, and they will support ISIS and Al-Qaeda rather than allow those organizations to come in. So the only
the only people who I think can actually resolve this ultimately are the Americans, because they're the only ones who are somewhat distanced from
the Sunni Shia divide and actually have the manpower to go in there. None of the other countries there are going to solve this. So, but I think doing that is going to require a lot more U.S. troops, and I'm not sure the American people will buy that unless if there's something like what happened in Paris in this country. I think you might see that.
Yeah, I mean, Syria is clearly a problem from hell, and one can sympathize with the desire on the part of the administration to not get drawn in, and the skepticism about the ability of American intervention to make a difference and not make a bad situation worse. But I think it's becoming really clear, especially in light of the Paris attacks, what the costs are of inattention. And we risk, we talk about our European allies, about the European Union. I think this unchecked flow, this tidal wave of refugees, of migrants into Europe really risks destabilizing the European Union. And ISIS itself risks further destabilizing the Middle East and exporting terrorism, as we've seen all around the world. So it's reached the point where I think neglect and attention is no longer possible, and a robust approach and a robust intervention is going to be necessary to defeat ISIS. But I don't believe that there can be a military solution without a diplomatic solution. And you can't have a diplomatic solution if you're not also willing to go in and take out ISIS, but they have to be married. We need a robust diplomatic agreement on a post-Assad Syria in which all the parties can agree, and that is easy to say and virtually impossible to achieve, but it's going to be the necessary foundation to a robust, potentially, if not U.S.-led, with a much stronger U.S. role in it to eradicate the threat.
I want to bite at this apple too. Start by protecting the people in Syria and take the pressure both of immigrants off of immigration to Europe and other places, but most importantly, take the pressure off of Turkey, Syria, and the neighboring countries that have 6 million Syrian refugees living there. That means creating safe zones along the Turkish and Jordanian border that we, along with others, are going to need to protect. I think a political deal that has Assad remaining in control of a rump Alawite state and giving Russia their base, but then permits the rest of the country to move forward and for us to fight along with the Syrian Sunni and others to uproot ISIS from their midst and take away their territory is my preferred solution.
All right, now I'm going to ask one more question. All right, we'll do two. I'm going to ask my question, then I want to come to you, and then we're going to do our wrap-up round here, where each panelist has to just give one bottom line recommendation. But the question I want to ask comes back to the one that was at this table earlier, which listening to all this advice about what to do about Syria. The first question is this our problem? Why do we have to do this? And the second part of that is, could we, even if we wanted to, and I'm not suggesting that we do want to, at least it doesn't seem like it, but even if we wanted to, do we really have the ability to fix these things? That seems to be an underlying thing, because everyone's talking about U.S. leadership, but leadership, exactly what does that mean? If it's not your problem and you can't fix this problem, what is leadership there? And let me pitch that first to our team that is advocating a robust American revival, and then pitch it back to Kori and Jim.
So in terms of can we actually fix Syria,
I think we can. I mean, is it our problem? Is it a tougher question? I think certainly it's now Europe's problem. Become very clear. I would say Europe is our most reliable partner, and I think on that basis you could argue yes that we should do it. I do think the Sunni Shiite violence, that idea that we can just sit back and let that play out, is I think going to hurt us in the long term if we do that, because the amount of hatred that's being generated there is going to touch us. I mean, we're already seeing it. We are certainly shielded to a greater degree than Europe is, but I don't think we'll be shielded entirely, and probably in our interest, it's in our long-term interest to see Europe not be completely destabilized by what's going on in Syria.
Do you want to, or do you want me to? Can we solve it, and should we solve it? Yes, we should help solve it, not only because I feel like a government that kills 250,000 of its own people and makes refugees out of 11 million others, and that we could pretty easily take care of and are choosing not to. I think that's a corrosion of the international order that we wanted to create and that we believe fervently in. Second, we should solve it because we helped create this problem, right? This didn't emerge organically. This is a function of the wars that are going on in the Middle East, and we have played a major role in them. We have a moral obligation. Third, the practical obligation that Mark mentioned, because this is destabilizing to a lot of our friends, and not just in Europe, Jordan, Turkey, other countries. Can we do it? Yes. I think about the successful model of provide comfort in northern Iraq, right? People are now talking about how the Kurdish territories are the only successful part of Iraq. Why is that? Because in 1991, we protected those areas as safe zones. We helped them set up governments. We grew a leadership we could live with. Yes, we can do this successfully. We've done it successfully in a lot of places.
Okay, in the middle table here.
Just a quick question for you. I was on the ground in Kiev a couple months ago, actually, and the resolve of the Ukrainian people is remarkable. So the question I have is, these people love their country. Why hasn't the U.S. led more? Should the West lead more? And what are the implications of that? What would that look like? The second question is, we have a variety of presidential candidates who are talking about their approach to dealing with ISIS, Syria. One who says he would bomb the expletive out of the oil fields and then take the oil. What are the implications of that? That's kind of a fun question for you. And then
Let's just
what are the implications of allowing Russia to lead?
Let's take one question. There's a question on Ukraine, which we haven't talked about yet. Why are we not doing more in Ukraine?
A few things. One, I'm not as optimistic about the Ukrainians and them figuring out their own conflicts and conflicted interests. Haven't seen I think the story is getting more muddled about where they're going in their trajectory. So I don't think the West, the United States, or Washington, for instance, in this, for the purpose of the discussion, has got a clear signal. The second point, the United States is not going to spend money on a faraway country. We just don't have the vision. Whether taking Yale's point, maybe we're more enlightened now and we're not going to get involved, but it's just we don't have the guts. We don't have the money. We don't have the willingness to make the security commitments that Ukraine needs.
Okay, Kori?
I think Ukraine's a hard example because they have blown earlier opportunities for positive change in 1991 and after the Orange Revolution. And yet, I still believe we should be doing a lot more to help them. I do think, though, that the international institutions, and in particular the International Monetary Fund, has been doing a lot that's really good. The European Union has been doing a good job of helping root out corruption, establish transparency. The IMF has been stalwart in dealing with the debtors, the creditors of Ukraine, and helping them get a fresh start. I think we haven't done half badly, although I wish we had done more. And of course, as DJ suggests, the center of gravity for Ukraine's success lies in Ukraine. But it's in all of our interests to show the Russians that Ukraine can and will be successful, because that's the right way to punish Russia's disgraceful behavior in Ukraine.
Okay, now to the middle table.
Thank you so much. We all, of course, we are now focused in Syria and the terrorist attacks in Paris and because how terrible those situations are. But there is one other problem, and we have not mentioned, maybe we have mentioned it very vaguely, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it has been a long time, and here the United States has a big word to say, and also a big responsibility, and we see it in every time there is a resolution proposed in the United Nations. That is very clear. What do you see, how do you see the panel see the perspective for this conflict? Thank you.
Do you want me to? I'm actually pretty downbeat about peace in the Middle East. I think Israel is changing in ways that will make peace with the Palestinians much harder. And I think the Palestinians are also changing in ways that will make peace much harder. I'm a lot less hopeful than I used to be. I wish my country actually had the ability to fix that problem, but I don't think we do, and I don't think we ever did.
Yeah, I think the U.S.-Israel relationship is, I think, one of the strongest examples of declining U.S. power. I mean, the breach of faith and trust between these two countries is really shocking.
Okay, now let me start wrapping this up because we have to finish. But the question I want each of you to answer, and we'll do it rapid fire, and I really just want 1 minute or less, even a sentence is just good, but a bottom line recommendation, so that if you were to give your advice either to the current administration or the next one, what would you like to see them do? What would be your advice going forward? Jim?
You want me to start? So I would simply elaborate on what I was saying earlier, that the great George Kennan argued that the United States couldn't be stronger abroad than we were at home. That he called the health and sanity of our institutions was critical to our ability to project power values in the world, and I think that's where we're falling down. This is a very complex world that we're facing today, just multiplying threats, and the notion that we can go in and engineer countries in our image, as was alluded to by one of the questioners, that's ancient history. That was only 10 years ago we thought so. We don't think that. Now we need to focus on, I'm exceeding my minute, I understand, but what we need is the next president and the next Congress to strike a deal on putting our finances on a sound footing so that we will pay for the government we need at home and the engagement we need overseas. And that's the predicate to rebuilding our military so that we can confront these challenges from a position of strength and confidence.
Get your house in order at home first before you worry about the rest of the world.
I endorse Jim's position completely. The most important constraint on American power is our inability to pay for especially the entitlement programs that we want. I don't want the next president and the next Congress to solve that problem. I want this president and this Congress to make an entitlements deal that'll put our federal spending on solid, sustainable footing.
Interesting. Okay. DJ.
As a Californian, I'll argue that the next leader needs to pull a Jerry Brown and fundamentally reform our political system so that we have strong center that appeals, that kind of matches the electorate's interests and really gets rid of this divisiveness.
Yeah, I would say a couple things need to be done. One, just the public diplomacy has to change. We are now in a position where the president is immediately saying we're not going to put boots on the ground before we do anything, which just undercuts everything we do. I do think we need to step up military spending probably to at least 4% of GDP. We're down well below that now. If you look in Asia, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East, we're all short on funding, and our military personnel are getting burned out. The rates of divorce and suicide are pretty alarming because we don't have the manpower to maintain all the commitments we have.
Interesting. Thank you very, very much. I just want to interestingly note that of our four debaters talking about is the U.S. losing the post-Cold War in the world, the answer starts with what we do domestically. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our debaters.
Thank you.